Alvin, will you please start? You are still muted.
Yes, okay, probably. Yeah. I start now. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be explaining and replicating the Apache Log4j vulnerability. So this security vulnerability, when it occurred, it was characterized as the single biggest, most critical vulnerability of the last decade. It was discovered by Alibaba Cloud Security team. It was first privately disclosed to Apache Foundation on 24 November last year, before being publicly disclosed on 9 December last year. After when it was publicly disclosed, it was recorded that there were more than 840,000 attacks initiated within 72 hours of the disclosure, and the attacks had reached over 100 per minute over the weekend. So why was this vulnerability reach the mainstream news or so? That was because that other than servers who had installed Log4j, if you happen to use a server as a site application that use Log4j, you can be affected also. This vulnerability is a zero-day remote code execution vulnerability in the logging framework. So if a cyber attacker has exploited this vulnerability, they can meet the server that's running Log4j to run the software that they want, including taking over the server completely. It was so serious that the Apache Software Foundation gave this vulnerability a score of 10 according to the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which is the highest score available. To understand the Log4j vulnerability, first I'll go through what is Apache Log4j. It is an open source logging framework that allows software developers to log various data for their Java applications, such as for the server, for the clients, for network monitoring software. It's used by thousands of websites and applications because the information log can be used for debugging, easy maintenance of their systems, and also it can store their application runtime information. It's even used by big companies such as Google, Apple, Microsoft, and also government organizations. Probably because it's also open source software. So what does Log4j do compared to conventional basic log formatting? It has actually an ability to perform lookups, such as map lookup, system properties lookup, and Java name and directory interface, or JNDI lookup. Log4j uses this JNDI API to obtain the naming and directory services from several available service providers, such as listed in this diagram in this slide. LDAP, DNS, INIS are some of them. The service that I bring to your attention here is LDAP. So how does this vulnerability actually work? This vulnerability takes advantage of Log4j not checking the LDAP and JNDI requests and allowing attackers to execute arbitrary Java code on the server. This is actually a classic example of missing input validation and blindly trusting the input sanitization. So what some of the hackers call this vulnerability is known as JNDI injection. For those of us who are familiar with database, there's also the issue of SQL injection. So now I'll go through actually how does attacker can exploit the vulnerability. First, the attacker will send a specially crafted request to a server running a vulnerable version of Log4j. The crafted request will perform JNDI injection through one of the services I mentioned in the previous slide. If the vulnerable version of the server use Log4j to log the request, the attacker will request a malicious payload over JNDI through one of the services from his own server to allow himself to execute arbitrary code on the logging server. To give a clear idea how it works, I will now go through an example of Log4j vulnerability, how it's being triggered using this expression that is to specify a lookup that will be through LDAP. An arbitrary URL will be queried and logged as a Java object data. So first, the attacker will send a crafted request to the vulnerable server as shown in the blue box.
Sorry, Alvin. So I think not every audience is very familiar with the
Okay.
GNDI. So can you briefly tell us a little bit about the GNDI mechanism? So especially for Java, right? So this is something. This is basically a mechanism for Java to look some resources. But will you please be a little bit more specific? So I think that is preliminary. I think that is preliminary to understand how the original function works and how the loophole is there in some very advanced function like GNDI facility.
So you're asking about the mechanism of GNDI.
Yeah, so more details, you can just provide more details of what is GNDI. So basically, just like the CQ injection. So basically, as you mentioned, this is a problem of GNDI injection, right? So,
Uh,
so I think a lot of people know what a secret is because this is a very primary and primitive query languages to interact with the database. And but not a lot of people know about GNDI. Will you please be more specific about this GNDI?
Actually, for myself, when I went through it also, I could not really grasp the concept of what GNDI does. I only was able to understand that yes, it will work with services to generate the naming and directory services, but for GNDI, I was not really very clear, although I read it, what it really was going to do other than logging.
So you're not that familiar. Basically, I think when you're given a presentation, I think it is basically you are constructing your own knowledge systems on certain aspect. Right? So when you're preparing the slides, it's a lot of knowledge structure building your mind, and basically the slides is a structure in your mind. Right? So I think GNDI is very important part for this one because you can see any vulnerabilities is kind of bug. And if we talking about a bug, they must be a feature. So if we talk about a feature, we care about what feature it is and why it's important, why people will use it, right? So Log4j, everyone know about it, and GNDI, very few people know about it. And the question is why Log4j are using GNDI and how GNDI can help Log4j accomplish its own task. So we will have a few questions here. So if you can address them well, then people really can have a better sense of what they're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, I just made comments here. So
Okay.
Anyway, so myself went to use GNDI a little bit, but I do not develop GNDI application. But this is for some Java to using some naming conventions to look for some resources on the server. For example, we want to search for some configuration files. We would like to use GNDI for it. But anyway, I'm not an expert here, so I raise some questions to Alvin. But anyway, so this problem is basically injection problem. So Alvin can keep going on to elaborate more about details.
Yeah, so what happens is that once the user once attacker send the crafted request in the blue box, it can be through a URL or login system of the vulnerable server. The request will load the data from the URL if the vulnerable server is connected from the internet. This will actually allows the attacker to be able to inject a Java class payload and execute his code from the server. So for instance, right now you see in this diagram, if the log4j vulnerability is triggered, the server will make a request to the attackerserver.com, in this case, through the JNDI. So what happens is that I will just do a demonstration of how the JNDI injection works using victim server, attacker server.
So let me rephrase it. Sorry, let me rephrase it a bit. So I'm not sure, I know how many of you follow that idea. So Alvin, will you please go to the previous slide? Yeah, so here, so I just want to clarify these pictures. So overall, as what I mentioned, so Log4j were using the GNDI to search for certain resources. And those resources could be either a configuration file or another web service or another program. So here the attacker is giving given these features, the attacker will construct another GNDI query, just like the GNDI and followed with a URL, and this URL is actually a URL of malicious server. So when the attackers will send such a request to the server, and the server will using GNDI to look for certain resources. In this time, the resources is an attack server. So when the server using log4j to execute such kind of the command, it will end up with downloading some malicious file or malicious program. And when this program is executed, sometimes the server will be compromised, and we can illegally log into the server. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So Alvin, so maybe I can. Why would be more specific about the payload information? So that's quite straightforward for the first example. And how about the second server force?
The second server. Okay. You mean the second
And
server?
why we need two servers here? So
actually, for me, what happened is that when I was experimenting, I interpreted it as like for terminal to control instead of the server itself. I am not too sure about how it actually this server itself, because the payload itself actually is for many kind of, depending on the creativity of the attacker, he can use a few ways to actually get the data or even push the data into there.
yeah,
But
based
yes,
on my understanding, this LDAP protocol is something to inject some malicious code into the vulnerable server. So you can see the attacker send queries, and after sending the query, before sending the query, the attacker have to set up a server called attack server.com, right? So when they execute the command, the vulnerable servers will be raise requests to such a malicious server to download malicious programs. And after the program is downloaded and run on the server, so at this time, the malicious programs will still need to contact the remote server, like the teststore server.com, to communicate with the server to download the other kind of the program. So this is basically what I understand.
okay.
Is that true, or do you have any complement for the interpretation?
For me, my interpretation when I was trying out a practical example was that when the user actually send a crafted, or the attacker send a crafted request to the vulnerable server, its own server must be running first, that it is actually trying to act as a intermediate server for the attacker to use another server to control it directly. That was my interpretation, but yeah, I may not be fully understand what is this diagram here showing. I just felt that it looked similar to what I was doing.
Yeah, so my interpretation is just the LDAP protocol is where the malicious program, the real malicious program is installed. And the request is just to trigger the server to download such malicious program. And when the malicious program is running on a vulnerable server, and then the server still have a need, maybe the malicious program have a need to interact with attack server, so that attack server can control the remote, can remotely control the vulnerable server.
Okay, I will go and look up that after this. Yeah. Okay, so now I just show a quick demonstration. I found a source code from GitHub and I modified a bit to suit my setup. This is the server itself. This was the GitHub server. So right now I have one of them is the vulnerable server. One of them is the attacker server. First, I will run a command here, which is to actually set up a logging system that use log4j as its logging for the username when user try to access the system.
Oh, you need to add HTTP, right?
So now this is the login page with the log4j vulnerable version. For the attacker server, I have to run first this command to actually generate a crafted request to generate out. So over here, this is the expression I mentioned earlier, where it contains the attacker server IP address. I have to insert this into the name function, username login, before I press enter. Before that, there is also one of these things that is a port here. I have to specify a port because, as I mentioned, when I went through the setup, in order to have control over the victim server, I will have to create another terminal to actually manipulate it. So now I will just create the login on the vulnerable server. Oh, I forgot to.
So you have two attackers and all the same.
Yes, I do have them on the same terminal.
And this attacker server is on the same server, right?
The attacker server is actually on the same server. The IP address you can see over here is
They're the same.
yeah, the same, yeah. But for some reason now, I don't know why it's not working. Maybe I just do a video later to show what I show here. Or maybe if you give me a quick second, I just restart everything.
Okay.
Oh, okay, I know why already.
Mm.
Yeah, because I accidentally put a port 1 in front of the port there. Now, as you can see, it received the connection after I press the enter. It's now gain access of the system. If I do IP address show, it shows me the victim server IP address that I'm already inside the victim, vulnerable server itself. If I were to do some commands like pwd, this is it shows the directory and the folders of all the files inside.
By the way, there's two different servers, so you do not have two computers, right? So one is on the server, so the victim server and
sorry, Prof. You're getting a bit soft. I can't hear your question.
yeah, I'm asking, yes, the victim and attacker are now in different servers. All
Yes.
different servers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the guy initially they did it on the same server, everything, and I find it a bit confusing, so I try to separate it out. There'll be at least easier for people to replicate.
And do you know what kind of the class has been downloaded in the victim server? So can we have local editor program or source code?
Oh, okay. The source code is,
I think what kind of program? So when we are injecting the GNDI command, right? We somehow download some. Basically, send a request to the attack server to download something, and when something is downloaded, it actually executed, right? So my question is, what kind of class is downloaded and executed on the victim server?
okay, I will find out that out and answer after in the group chat. Yeah, okay, thank you. I did because I'm still very this was
I understand. I think it's good work to shoot all the for J. how to look into the log4j vulnerabilities and to see how the remote control has been illegally accessed. I think that's a good work. My suggestion for you is that we not just implement it, especially when you start a part-time PhD in the future or the coming semester, right? So when you are working on these, basically, we need to investigate why and what is the reason behind it. And based on such a case, and how could we further proceed in research, right?
Okay. I will. Thank you, Prof.
And also, maybe I just have a few questions for you. So in this
Okay.
case, and how does industry mitigation for such a vulnerability?
Actually, I got a slide to show about the how mitigation itself. I maybe just say quickly is that what I show here was the web application for the setup. There's also for Ghidra demonstration and Minecraft for those who are interested and use it before to test out the vulnerability. So for the industry, what they strongly recommend people nowadays is to first upgrade your log4j version based on your Java version. You can see that there's different log4j version recommended for the Java version that they have been using. The other way is actually they disable the lookup for JNDI, such as removal of a class file from one of the system, or they set the no lookup flag to true for log4j. That is what I see commonly across a few articles, how they try to mitigate the vulnerability. That's all for this tutorial I have prepared.
So basically, that is the vulnerability to log4j version. Maybe in the future, maybe we can think more about the code there. Very interesting vulnerabilities. I have no more questions. So, is there anyone have a question for Alvin for more about this log4j vulnerability? I think that's raised a huge impact at the end of last year. Anyone have a question for Alvin?
May I? I'm sorry that I cannot fully understand the log4j, but I saw how modify this is just they close the lookup function so that to close. But if you want to still use the lookup, because previously they used the lookup class. The reason is that they need to use. Then if they close this, how they can?
They take the first solution. They upgrade the version to 2.7.1. So the point is here. So there's a vulnerability in the older version of log4j Java, right?
Yeah.
So they have two choices. The first choice is that because you can see this vulnerability is discovered by Alibaba, right? So
yes, by Alibaba.
By Alibaba researchers. So they first privately contact Apache Foundation for such vulnerability, and then they disclose such a vulnerability 2 weeks after the contact. So within 2 weeks, I think the Apache Foundation has already delivered a version without such vulnerability. So they can still use all the versions, still using the lookup functions from JNDI. But for the other, but you can see, even if they have delivered such a version, the client applications may not adapt it to the new version quickly. So they still have a lot of vulnerabilities. So people, when they scan the server, they find a lot of server, as long as using log4j, the server have vulnerabilities. In this case, so as long as they upgrade their log4j Java version, and the problem is just gone. If they do not want to update it, so another mitigation or another second choice is to just disable it. Disable such a lookup function for JNDI. I hope I explained it. Any questions for Alvin? Dr. San, do you have any question?
No more, I think. Thank us.
Okay. So if there's no more questions, maybe we can call it. I think this is supposed to be a short one because we have deadline coming. and we can have a more, and we will have another, our next meeting suppose on 22, right? So we'll still skip the meetings in next week. We will resume the group meeting in next week. Okay, thanks everyone to join us. Bye.